Good morning. Um, Here we are in our old hometown again of the Raymond James Room. I'm having a little technical difficulty today in the theater, and we appreciate your moving with such alacrity to respond to this new situation. So we're home again in the RJ. So my name is Kimberly McQuarrie, and I am the Director of Programming and the Co-Director of the Innovation Labs here at the Dali Museum. And we're super excited for this live and streaming version of our Coffee with the Curator series. We're joined by my incomparable colleague, Peter Tush, who is going to explore Dali's Hispanic heritage today in a lecture that is a part of our pretty robust series of events that we have had on to celebrate Hispanic Heritage Month. Unfortunately, those events have been a little bit impacted by the unfortunate events of the last couple of weeks. But obviously that's nothing compared to the people who are down in the Fort Myers area who have suffered such tremendous losses. And our thoughts are with them. Now, before we get to Peter's talk, we'd like to thank, of course, the City of St. Petersburg. They are, with their continued sponsorship of the museum, part of what makes events like this possible. And of course, as always, we want to thank our members because you're integral to absolutely everything we do. We hope that you are going to visit our website to find out more about our upcoming programs, including the last event that we have to celebrate Hispanic Heritage Month, this coming up this Thursday. And I will give you a little preview of some of the things that we have in store for you this month. So this Thursday, you can join Dr. Adriana Novoa, who is a professor at USF, and she's going to be giving a really fascinating lecture on Latin America and surrealism. This was originally scheduled to be a coffee talk, but unfortunately, due to presenter illness, it had to be postponed, and it's going to take place this Thursday. So if you get a chance, you should come out and check it out. It's going to be a really great talk. This Saturday, I am going to be giving a workshop on creative problem solving as part of our two-part series. I did an introduction to creative thinking in September, and now I'm doing part 2, which is the introduction to creative problem solving this Saturday. So if you are interested in getting your creativity on, you can come and join me there. On Thursday of the coming week, of course, we have our amazing Poetry at the Dali series, and we have a couple of great poets for you. Or if a little bit of physical activity is more your speed, you can join us next weekend for our Yoga at the Dali. Our signature, one of our signature events is also coming up this month. I don't know how many people, raise your hands if you have tickets to Sueños already, and you're, yeah, woo, excited to get dressed up around Halloween time and enjoy a really amazing party and event. And this year, the theme is Zodiac, so that should be a ton of fun. And then we will also have a story time. If you have any kids in the family, kids, grandkids, and want to bring them by, we're having story time towards the end of the month. And then Peter will also be rounding out our month of October with a lecture on Dali's ghosts. And we're also that night gonna be having some special ambient music and some pop-up tours in the gallery focused on Dali's interest in ghosts. And if I can manage it, I'm gonna try. If you wanna come in costume, we might have a little costume contest and some prizes for that. So a lot of fun stuff coming up. And as usual, if you see something you enjoy, if you hear a talk that you enjoy, reach out and let us know, either by calling the museum or you can always share on social media, #TheDali, and we'll always respond to you. Now, I'd like to introduce my wonderful colleague in the education department, Peter Tush. He is, of course, the senior curator of education here at the Dali, where he's worked for several decades. As he likes to call himself, he's a legacy. He's a legacy employee. That's what he likes to call himself. Peter's work touches every corner of this museum. He's the key interpreter of the permanent collection and also works on our special exhibitions. He trains our docents, some of whom are in this room, writes the scripts for our audio guides, directs school programming, and works with the curatorial team. He does it all. He's a jack of all trades, he really is. Over the years, he's been a fixture, of course, of this Coffee with the Curator series, and he's presented many, many talks on anything from women in surrealism to Dali's holiday cards to a great lecture, if you missed it in June, on Dali and the beach. So he's really covered every nook and cranny of Dali and of Dalinian studies. And today, as part of our celebration of Hispanic Heritage Month, he's going to dig into the topic of Dali's Hispanic heritage and Dali's deep connections to his country, language, and heritage. So please join me in welcoming Peter Tosh.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you, Kim, very much for a wonderful introduction. And we are here today talking about Dali in relation to his heritage, his identity, and Hispanic Heritage Month. So very quickly, just to remind everybody, Hispanic Heritage Month is a very strange thing because it begins September 15th and runs through October 15th. It's a U.S. celebration of the contributions made by Americans tracing their roots to Spain, Mexico, Central America, etc. Dali, we're kind of bundling into this idea because he considered himself in many ways to be connected to America and spent a great deal of time here in the States. So we are bringing him in through the back door, so to speak. And it's also worth noting that when we were at our fullest in terms of school tours and before the pandemic, we had many, many more language groups coming to visit the museum than we did visual arts groups. And that's because Dali is such an essential part of Spanish identity and learning about Spain and learning about culture that we really feel very honored by this situation. Also, it's worth remembering that our founders, Reynolds and Eleanor Morse, were awarded by the order of King Carlos of Spain the Cross of the Officer of the Order of Isabella the Catholic in 1989. And this knighting is the highest honor the Spanish government bestows upon a non-Spanish citizen. So this was in recognition of their contribution to Spanish culture in the United States in support of Dali. So we are very honored, and we still have the ambassador of Spain to the United States as part of our board. Each new ambassador comes onto our board each time. So it's a great honor that we have, and we try to do what we can to make sure that Dali becomes known to the masses and how he represents Spanish culture. So let's talk a little bit about Dali's identity, and we can start with Time magazine. So while he was not a US citizen, America was certainly Dali's second home. He would spend the fall time here at the St. Regis. He would spend the spring in Paris, of course, at the Hotel Maurice, and then summers in Spain. And this was pretty much typical of him for the last 2 to 3 decades of his life. But in terms of his identity, even though he's not officially American, he isn't also just officially Spanish either. He's a combination of regional and national. He is a Catalan as well as a Spaniard. He is regional and he is national, and that combination, that dance that he does between representing Spain and representing Catalonia is really going to be the focus of my talk. And it's worth remembering that Catalonia is very much like Quebec. We all have a pretty good understanding about how unique Quebec is in relation to Canadian culture. Catalonia is very similar to that in relation to Spanish culture. They have their own language. They have a very unique culture that is very much and fiercely their own. And then they are extremely independent in terms of how they define themselves. And so Dali does this wonderful dance throughout his career, going back and forth between being the representative of Spain, which has national accolades, but also representing the region he's from in a very unique way that's sometimes not as well embraced by other Spaniards. So certainly the idea of Catalonia as far as running through Dali's blood goes back to his childhood. This is the region of Catalonia here in the upper left-hand side of the screen of the map. So this is the Catalan region of Spain, just under France, right on the water. Barcelona is part of Catalonia. A lot of money coming into Spain through Barcelona before it gets to Madrid. So historically, it was a very rich culture. And as a result, they were able to really develop their culture in a very unique way. On the right-hand side, that triangle is known as the Dali Triangle, and it's the three places. It's Figueres, where Dali's museum is. It's Port Legat and Cadaqués, where his house was. And at the very bottom is Poubal, which is the castle that he purchased for Gala, where she lived. Here we see Dali as a child, and you can see the streets in this postcard next to him. This is from the early 1900s, so born in 1904 in Catalonia in Figueres. And Figueres is an agricultural community. Figueres is a place that it's close to the Pyrenees and close to the Mediterranean, but has these beautiful wide open fields that are very rich. And so there's a lot of commerce that happens in Figueres. The other thing about Figueres is it's the only place, or it's the last place, the last train stop you hit before you move into France. So people going back and forth from France to Spain always have to go through Figueres. So that also helped to its prosperity. Dali came from an extended family that valued their heritage very strongly, particularly his father, who was somewhat affluent, somewhat wealthy because he was a notary. And one of the things that he did is he commissioned the collection of the music related to the Spanish sardanas in order to keep that cultural heritage alive for Catalans. So very committed to it. They also were very close with another culturally esteemed family, which was the Pichot family. These were neighbors of theirs in Cadaqués during the summers, and also they were neighbors in Figueres during the rest of the year. As an extended family, the Pichots were very blessed. They had a number of major musicians, nationally recognized musicians in their family. They had an opera singer who was celebrated throughout Europe, and they also had Raymond Pichot, the painter, who was very good friends with Pablo Picasso. So a very unique family, and certainly a family that encouraged Dali's cultural strivings and really supported him. Dali, of course, also very connected to his landscape. Landscape was essential to Dali, and so from the very beginning to the very end, it's really that same landscape along the Mediterranean and the Costa Brava. And so just a couple examples of some of the slides I think I shared also with Dali at the beach. This is one from the very beginning of his career when he was 13 years old, and then one from the period of time when he's 52 years old, and it's still that celebration of the area. When he went into surrealism and things became, very strange and very dreamlike, we can still see very specific connections back to the unique features of the landscape. Like the photograph on the right here by Clyde Butcher, you can see those kind of openings, those fissures inside of the rock, which Dali duplicates here into the standing stone at the bottom of his painting. And of course, the self-portrait that we know Dali by, which is the portrait that's in The Persistence of Memory, almost like an embryo that's washed up on the beach. It's basically a head where the skull has been removed, more gelatinous, was inspired by a particular rock structure that's very close to where Dali grew up in Cap de Creus. And so all of these things are just constant connections back to the place where he was born and where he lived almost his entire life. Also, it's worth remembering, and this starts to get into the more complicated area, as a language growing up in, Dali was bilingual. He was both familiar with Catalan and Spanish languages. So the Catalan language was probably spoken around the house. Spanish language was the business language and the language of school. So it's also worth knowing that, of course, when he went to school, he also started to learn French. Dali was somewhat fluent in all three of these languages, and then eventually in English as well. He was a terrible speller. It's just worth pointing that out. He was never a good speller, whether it was Catalan, English, Spanish, whatever. And then, of course, following the Civil War, the Spanish Civil War, the Catalan language was outlawed for decades until Franco passed. So there was also the prohibition of the Catalan language. And so that also forced a lot of people like Dali to really cherish and treasure this thing that was basically outlawed, which was their language and culture. Now, when we turn to the scientific side of Dali's interests, we also have a strong Catalan connection, and it's even a more regional and more local than simply Catalonian. This is a photograph of an explorer and an engineer named Narcís Monturiol, and he was one of the first inventors of an operational submarine. And the submarine is going to be in the next slide, but the monument to him on the far right basically was just down the block from Dali's house where he was born. So he saw this monument day after day. And I think it left a big impression on Dali growing up in the kind of the Jules Verne age of science and science fiction. Everything's possible. Everything's about exploring the outer space and exploring the depths of the sea. And so Monturiol was somebody that he thought about a lot. This is the submarine he invented on the left-hand side. And then, of course, partially Dali's obsession with deep sea and with being inside of movable structures. Seems like the Ovoceped that Dali developed on the right-hand side, sort of that human hamster ball, is in some ways an homage or a tipping of the hat to the great Narcís Monturiol. And very clearly, when Dali gave a lecture in 1936 and dressed in a diving suit, the metaphor was that he was like an explorer diving into the unconscious to bring back the treasures, but it was very much inspired, again, Narcís Monturiol. And Dali has comments about him in his Secret Life where basically he talks about his anger over Narcís Monturiol sort of stealing his own thunder. Like Narcís Monturiol got there first, but Dali had to better him somehow. So, you know, there was already that sense of competition when he was growing up as a child. In terms of religion, Dali talks about his childhood Parthenon, which is located in Cadaqués. And just to mention, Dali's mother was a devout Spanish Catholic. His father was an atheist. He grew up very aware of both of these kind of diametrically opposed ideas. But as a child, he certainly went to school or went to church every Sunday. And so the one church that I think really left with him this kind of the wonder of the religious experience was the church in Cadaqués. And Dali celebrated it in his artwork over and over again. So this is a painting called Port d'Alguer. You can see the church of Santa Maria de Cadaqués right there in the center, towering above. What's unique about the church is that it has one of the best examples of a late Baroque altarpiece. And that's what we see here on the left-hand side, and it's absolutely massive. So the church itself is a little smaller than the room we're in right now, and yet it goes up about 3 floors. So you step in and you have this very shallow space and this wondrous, you know, large, almost like a, you know, golden crusted organ that dominates everything. So Dali talks about this religious experience that he had as a child growing up and visiting this church. Bless you. Also, there's the Catalan Sardana, this particular dance that's really unique to the region. It's a circle dance that goes back to Phoenician and Roman times. This is a photograph from a postcard celebrating that. You can see the church in the background of Cadaqués, and all of the men are wearing these red hats, which are the baratinas of the region. And it's a dance that has a very simple move, and you join hands, and it can be very large or very small, but it's got ancient origins, and people are very proud of it. Dali incorporated it into a drawing that he did for a particular poster called the Sardana of the Witches, where you can see the Sardana danced by these mythical beasts over the church and with the mountain in the background, Mount Pani. So a celebration in his own artwork, and also, as I mentioned, his father had gathered the music that was written for these dances and compiled that so it could be saved and shared for future generations. There's also the reference throughout Dali's work to the baratina, the Catalan baratina, which, as I mentioned, it's this red hat. These are 2 paintings in our collections, and in both of these paintings, there's figures that are probably Dali's self-portraits where the gentleman is wearing this red baratina. It's you don't see it much anymore, but when we had the farmers working the fields, very much most of the people out in the fields would wear these red baratinas. So where this starts to open up more broadly is when Dali was in high school, he started to write for his local school newspaper. And he basically was given the opportunity to write about the artists that he loved. And his father had purchased for him this book of several books related to the great artists of the ages. And Dali would take an opportunity and write about one of these artists in each one of the magazines. And so he writes about all of his heroes, Raphael, Leonardo da Vinci, Velázquez, Vermeer. And this is typical of kind of the book report that Dali would turn in each time. You know, it was very succinct, but it was always filled with glowing, romantic words about the glory of each one of these artists. So it's really very fun. And then, of course, when Dali started to broaden his definition of who he was from being just a Catalan Spaniard to being Spanish was when he went to Madrid for art school. Going to Madrid is a very, very different experience. And one of the things that is often noted is that Dali thought he would leave an impression on the people from Madrid by growing his hair long, by having long sideburns, by wearing these dramatic kind of capes and outfits. And what he discovered is that he was seen as a very rural bumpkin by most of the people. The sophistication definitely ruled the day. And Dali basically had to be persuaded to more or less turn himself into a gentleman of the day. And that happened in his second year during school. But he had access to the Prado, which certainly changed his understanding and estimation of Spanish art, as well as European art. So he was exposed to some of the greatest artists from Goya to Velázquez, plus he experienced Hieronymus Bosch. Some of the best Bosch paintings are there in Madrid. He also went to the Residencia. This is where he stayed, his dormitory, while he was attending the San Fernando Academy of Art. And he had the opportunity to meet some of the most important figures who were emerging in Spanish culture at that time. Particularly, and we come back to them over and over again, Federico Garcia Lorca, the poet and playwright, and then Luis Buñuel, who became Dali's colleague when they entered into Surrealism. So, future filmmaker, and current poet who becomes one of the greatest poets of Spain of the 20th century and martyred because he was, of course, killed by Franco's legions. Dali also emerged to be represented as one of the figures that they call the generation of 27. So here's a photograph of him with Buñuel and Lorca again, but also with Jose Antonio Rubio Sacristan and Jose Moreno Villa. There was a number of key figures, and they were all associated with Madrid and with the schools that were that these various students were attending. And it really became this moment where Spain would have become great again in the modern age if the Spanish Civil War had not, broken out in the following decade. Returning back to this point, so Dali is at art school. He's experiencing Spanish culture on the broad scale, but he still keeps coming back to some of the Catalan influences. The gentleman on the right-hand side is a really important artist from this area known as Joaquim Sunyer. And he was part of what was called the Noucentismo, the new spirit, the new age of Catalan painting. And it was a combination of Cézanne with geometry and yet very rural sort of celebrations of people connected to the earth, livestock, farming. And you can see Dali's painting, this great one that we have called Cadaqués, borrows very liberally from that style, a kind of simplicity, a sort of almost folkloric type of celebration. And of course, the painting that we have of bread, unlike that Catalan source, the basket of bread in our collection goes back to the much more broad Spanish source of Zurbarán, and this idea of kind of ritual presentation of a religious source of food, which becomes much more symbolic of the church and of faith. So he's walking this kind of path, going back and forth. And then, of course, when Dali is 22 years old, he's about to graduate, he gets the chance finally to go to Paris. And the first thing he does is he goes and he meets Pablo Picasso. He gets a letter of introduction. Picasso's 23 years older than him. And Picasso, although totally immersed in Catalan culture, really represents Spain on a broad scale. And so this is a moment of transformation where I think Dali starts to understand the importance of being Spanish and not just being Catalan. And so this is a period of time where Dali sees the greatness of Picasso. He wants to be Picasso. He wants to learn from him and surpass him. And Dali's artwork starts to become much more ambitious and proto-surrealist, looking at this kind of geometry that Picasso had developed and the kind of symbolism that Picasso was interested in at that point. Not quite sure what happened to all these, the texts. I apologize for that. But then the moment happens, the moment of change where Dali has to purge himself from Catalan experience. He realizes Catalonia is folkloric, it's backwards, it's not modern at all, it's all hackneyed and old school. And so he goes out of his way to really start lashing out at the very things he celebrated when he was younger. And the first major gesture of that is this particular document called the Manifeste Groc, or the Yellow Manifesto. And he and two other student colleagues write this basic out-and-out denunciation of everything that was Catalan. The Catalan, we denounce the unhealthy sentimentality served up by the Orfeo Català, which is this beautiful Catalan performance art opera house with its, with its worn repertory of popular song adapted from and adulterated from the people with the least feeling for music in the world, et cetera, et cetera. It goes on like that for a long time. And he celebrates everyone from Picasso to the futurists to anything that's modern. So it's this moment of purging. And they basically distribute it to anybody that they can find to make this new statement. And this is the moment where Dali falls under the spell of Surrealism. So we think of Surrealism as being a French movement, a French art movement, but the first stages, the first sort of steps that Dali takes towards it are deeply inspired by a fellow Catalan, Joan Miró, who's already a Surrealist. So Dali is looking to the Catalan side of Surrealism to try to start making his move into that culture. And when he does paintings like Apparatus in Hand, he still is going out of his way to attack Catalonia. So the particular book over here on the right-hand side is called Platero y Yo, or Platero and Myself. Platero is the name of a particular donkey. This was written by a gentleman named Juan Jimenez. It was seen as one of the great examples of Catalan modernism. And it was celebrating basically the life of this particular farmer and his connection with his donkey that helped him every day. The donkey passes away, but the bond is so strong, the ghost of the donkey comes back to accompany him in his old age. So it's a very sweet story. Dali goes out of his way to defile the story. So this donkey that's here, it's swarming with flies, it's dead, it's basically being torn apart. It is not experiencing its best day. So this is Dali basically attacking this well-loved modern story. And that's the way he's more or less processing the influence of Spain in general and also Europe, trying to get Spain into the modern world. So what he does is when he finally goes to Paris, he brings his Spanish and Catalan culture with him to introduce to all these French artists. So there's something particularly Spanish about Dali's approach to all of this. To begin with, we have The Andalusian Dog, which was his film that he made with Luis Buñuel, which attacked everything. A lot of the stories were particularly local, related to each of them and their own obsessions and phobias, but there was something very international about the way they presented it. It felt very relevant to everybody, whether you were French, Spanish, German, English. It was powerful and it was universal. And this allowed Dali to buy his first little fisherman's hut here on the left-hand side, which eventually becomes the great house in Port Legat. But a little bit of funding from this allows him to really plant his first step into this region on his own. So this is where he builds his house, and this is the house that he will continue to live in throughout his life. Also, as far as continuing this attack on Catalonia, so we're going back and forth, there's the tradition of the Caganer, and probably most of you are very familiar with this, but it is basically the small figure that goes behind the Catalan manger scene. It is called the shitter, and it is a folkloric figure taking a crap, basically. And the idea is that he's giving back to the earth what was brought from the earth. It's very earthy, it's very unpleasant for a lot of people, it's seen as very inappropriate, but it's very much part of Catalan culture. And Dali starts to use this to defile other Catalan figures. For example, this is a painting in our collection, The Hand of Remorse, and you can see that this particular writer, Frederic Soler, now has excrement smeared on his pants as a way of attacking his importance. So Dali is using these kinds of things to, again, undermine Catalonia. And then he turns the page and he goes in a slightly different direction. As Dali starts to develop as a surrealist, he starts to look to his Catalan roots also for inspiration. And about 1934 is when the tide turns and he starts looking to Antoni Gaudi. And he realizes that there's no more surreal experience than the incredible architecture, the Art Nouveau architecture of Gaudi. And so this is the apartment building of Casa Mila in Barcelona. Dali just was overwhelmed by this kind of undulating style of this oozing and almost living type of form of building. And this is what leads to his sort of melted forms that you see in Persistence of Memory and other paintings. That melting, oozing, irrational kind of structure comes from a catalyst of inspiration. Dali also starts to think about the ruins that were found in his local community in the Amsterdam region. And so he starts to incorporate some of those more uncanny experiences that you can have with past cultures and civilizations with these standing stones and old ruins that you can find in the area, and he incorporates those into his surrealist paintings. So here we have a standing stone, a monolith that winds up in profanation of the host. Here we have some of the ruins from the founding of Emporius, which also find their way into that same painting, into the font, with these large and strange references to arches and to columns that seem to go nowhere. And Dali also is thinking about something, very specific that he sees every day outside of his window in Port Lagat, which is that women mend fishing nets. And this leads to one of his most beautiful paintings, which is the Weaning of Furniture Nutrition, where the woman who raised him as a child, his nanny, has now become a woman mending a fishing net on the beach outside of his house. It's very surreal. You don't really need to know those two things to find it to be an uncanny painting, but it's something very local and very regional that's inspiring these amazing visions. And then, of course, the Spanish Civil War moves Dali out of that Catalan headspace. It becomes national. Everything is national. So the Civil War defines what you are as a Spaniard, whether you're for or against Franco's Legion. It changed the world. It led to World War II. It basically meant that Dali's generation of 27 never went on to become the great representatives of New Spain, because Spain was torn apart during the Civil War. Dali spent most of the time traveling throughout Europe, particularly to Italy, and he met people like Edward James, who wound up introducing him to a lot more sophisticated European culture than Dali had been exposed to up until that point. And one of Dali's most important paintings from his entire career is the Soft Construction with Boiled Beans, which is a specific response to the building crisis, which eventually is unleashed during the Spanish Civil War. It was finished just before, about a week or two before the war is actually called. So it defines the intense unease with Spain that's tearing itself apart. It also is a reference to another Spanish figure, Goya. One of Goya's most unpleasant representations is these dead figures that are strapped onto the particular tree, which partially suggests that the dead tree with the melting watch from the persistence of memory, but much more clearly relates to the structure of this figure that's ripping itself apart. So Dali's looking to Spain, he's influenced by Spain, and he's responding to what's happened. Of course, Dali loses many, many friends and colleagues in the 1950s when he aligns himself with Franco. Dali's basically an apolitical beast. He is a person who will go in whatever direction there is to basically allow him to do what he wants to do as he's been doing it. And if it had been a socialist who took charge of Spain, he probably would have been socialist. If it had been a Republican, he would have gone in that direction. But Franco was in charge, and Dali aligns himself with Franco so that he can remain in Spain, but at the same time have this international recognition and ability to travel. It's also worth noting that Dali's political ideals are really monarchist, which that's not what Franco was. But Dali loved the idea of the world of Velázquez, being the painter who has the king's ear. And that's very much the way he saw himself in the middle of the 20th century. So here we have a moment of Dali meeting with power. And this is what allowed him to have his museum in the following decade. Dali's nuclear mysticism, when he reinvents himself following World War II, is not inspired by Catalonia, but it's inspired by Spanish mysticism, a much more broad sense of what the Spanish mystical religious experience is about. So this is Dali with the book that he wrote on the Mystic Manifesto of 1951, where he says for the first time the history of science and physics is providing proof of the existence of God. That was how his understanding of the atomic bomb and the science behind the bomb was starting to change his ideas about art. And his first major statement related to this was inspired by a particular Spanish mystic, and that's St. John of the Cross. And his particular vision of Christ seen from God's point of view was very influential on Dali. And so Dali creates this sort of post-atomic sci-fi Christ, Christ as perfection, rising above Portlagat, the Bay of Portlagat, but representing this sort of Spanish understanding of mysticism related to atomic energy. And so we come back to connecting with the larger Spanish legacy of art that builds on this idea. So around the mid-1950s, Dali starts to really become obsessed with Velázquez. He returns to the ideas of Velázquez, and one of the great paintings in our collection is this Velázquez painting, the Infanta Margarita, which is a reference to this wonderful painting of the young Infanta that was used to basically try to find a spouse for her. And it was shipped to different courts around Europe. Dali was so aware of the importance of this politically and egotistically, narcissistically, that he made sure that he did not miss out on the opportunity to go into the Prado with his painting, pose next to the original one by Velázquez, and make sure that everybody understood the connections that he was trying to make with this painting. That Dali has sort of taken the mantle, or is continuing the mantle, of the great Velázquez. And if you were well, that's the next slide. If you were in Spain, it was not the wacky, crazy mustache of that mad Dali. It was the great homage to the master Velázquez. It was understood implicitly that Dali was weaving himself into Spanish culture, whereas here in America, that was really not understood at all. And so it was just one more strange and bizarre thing by that bizarre, unusual artist from Surrealism. He also starts to expand on the ideas of Spanish Catholicism, and so a painting that's up in Fredericton, Canada, was on loan to us. The Santiago el Grande celebrates St. James the Great, the patron saint of Spain, and it also is a major reference to the Santiago de Compostela and the Way of St. James, the pilgrimage that's, so many people across the world join in following the pilgrimage of the Way of St. James. And so that's paid tribute to in this particular painting. So Dali, again, thinking about his legacy, thinking about Spain as being, in a way, the more important of the two between Catalonia and Spain. Spain has the lasting influence of really placing you in history. So this is where things get kind of interesting, because we have a painting in our collection, which is The Discovery of America, where Dali's trying to have it both ways. And I find that to be the most interesting part about this painting. So this is The Discovery of America by Christopher Columbus. And the important thing that had happened around this time is that Dali was reading a Peruvian historian who proposed that Columbus was not from Italy, but rather was from Spain, and in particular was from Girona. And Columbus often wrote in Catalan, and for Dali, this became like a great discovery. So for Dali, this meant that the discovery of the New World was not done by Italians, but rather by a fellow Catalan. And that needed to be celebrated, because not only was it a fellow Catalan, Dali saw him as like a version of himself in advance. So Dali becomes Columbus in this painting, essentially. He's discovering the New World in the 1930s, and Gall is the one who's inspiring him to make this voyage. So there's all these references to Columbus as Catalan, and then there's also references to Velázquez. So the vertical lines up at the upper right refer to these vertical lines of the halberds that are in the Velázquez painting, Surrender of Breda. So it's also a celebration of the 300th anniversary of the passing of Velázquez. And yet, again, something very local. There was a folk legend in the area where Dali was born that on 3 occasions, French invaders tried to come over the Pyrenees and conquer this region. And the story goes that this particular bishop, St. Narciso, who had been dead a number of years, his crypt opened up on each occasion, and swarms of flies came out and drove back these French invaders. And so in this little region where Dali is from, Catalonia, really Girona, just a little bit north of Figueres, they still celebrate to this day the miracle of the flies. And they celebrate it with a feast where there's fly-shaped pastries that are baked, and people drink and enjoy themselves. But it's the idea that it's independence for this really small region, that you would not know anything about the story or the miracle unless you were from there. And Dali turns it into this painting that's really about Spain, about discoveries of new worlds, making it a much more international idea. And Dali was always close with the fishermen of his region. So Port Legat was always about the fishermen. He knew the names of the fishermen, let them store their oars and things in his building. They would help him with his paintings. And he celebrates them in this painting called Tuna Fishing, where this is really about the struggle of man against beast. It's about this amazing battle between these fishermen and these tuna. And it was a story he remembered his father telling him about some of these Catalan fishermen. So he's thinking very specifically about a story from his childhood. And we're almost done. We've come finally to the Spanish bullfight. Bullfighting is not really related to Catalonia. It is a southern Spanish tradition. There is a bull ring in Barcelona. Sometimes there are bullfights, but definitely it's not something that's really Catalan. It's much more broadly Spanish. And Dali's great final work that he creates before he starts devoting himself completely to his museum is the Toreador, the hallucinogenic Toreador, where the Venus de Milo transforms into a variety of different images of this Spanish bullfighter. Inspired by simply a simple box of pencils, Dali sees the Venus and starts to see a face, but the face is very particular. The face eventually becomes the face of Manolete, the great Spanish bullfighter who was gored while in his prime in this great battle, I believe in 1940, I think is when it happened. This is the photograph of him. He was age 30, it was in 1947, and here you can see that moment where he loses his life. Looks very much like Adrian Brody. He played him in the movie about Manolete, so a nice coincidence. But it goes back also to Federico Garcia Lorca, who had written the Homage to Ignacio Sanchez Mejias, who was the great Spanish bullfighter who was also gored to death much earlier. So Dali's connecting himself with his past Spanish colleague, Federico Garcia Lorca, the idea of the Spanish bullfight, and he's really summarizing his whole career using this idea of Spain rather than Catalonia. So Catalan or Spanish, where do we find Dali's identity? He is buried in his museum in Spain, and he also, in 1982, received that same cross of the Order of Charles II, and he also was bequeathed the title of the Marquis de Poubal by the King and Queen of Spain. Probably the greatest honor he had. Sadly, he was in very bad shape and not really able to celebrate the way that he would have 10 years earlier. And of course, he passed away in Figueres of heart failure. And the gesture, let's see, his last will and testament was the thing that really was the most controversial thing, perhaps, of the last part of his life, because everyone in Catalonia thought that his legacy would be Catalan, that he would give everything to Figueres and to his museum, and instead he gave it to the government of Spain. And there's a lot of different, depending on who you talk to, everybody has a theory about why this happened. One of the key things, though, is that by giving it to Spain rather than just Catalonia, he is always woven into the culture of Spain rather than the more local region that he loves so much. So even in his dying day, Dali maintains this division of loyalties and this bifurcation of identity. And in summary, just a couple of things to point out. He's born, his birth and death are in Catalonia. His education is on Figueres. He, let's see, these are the ways that he's Catalan. So education, certainly in language, he spoke it, and religion. He was transfixed by the church of his youth. Mythological figures include Narcís Monturiol and San Narciso, two very strong Catalan figures. The traditions of the sardanes, the Baratina, the Caganer, these are very important to his work. Artistic influences from Catalonia include the Noucentismo and Pierre Raymond Pichot. He was inspired by Miro when he went into Surrealism and Gaudi. His politics were anti-Catalan for a period of time, and his allegiance, his museum is built right there in Catalonia. But in terms of Spanish culture, he went to Madrid to learn to be a great artist. His language was really Spanish throughout his life, even though he knew Catalan extremely well. His friendships with Buñuel and Lorca made him much more internationally Spanish. He was completely committed to the ideas of St. John of the Cross and the Compostela, so Spanish Catholicism. Manolete was a key figure mythologized in the hallucinogenic Toreador. His mustache was a reference to Velázquez. His artistic influences were all primarily Spaniards rather than just Catalans. The movie Ancien Andalou is much more about Spain. His politics were definitely more towards the monarchy of Spain and the idea of Velasquez and the king. And finally, his allegiance, he leaves his estate to the government of Spain, not to the government of Catalonia. So lots of things to think about on this moment here during this period of time with the Hispanic Heritage Month. Hopefully there's a few things here that will give you something to think about as you go back into the collection and explore. And with that, I thank you all for coming this morning. Thank you very much. And I think there's an event here at 11:30, so I know they're going to be asking us to leave, but yes, sir.
Is there time for one question?
Yep.
Is there any clarity available from his attachment with Franco and the division with Picasso in terms of Spanish identity or his own identity?
Yeah.
Is there clarity to be gained from that? I mean,
Well, it seems like his relationship and friendship with Picasso really ends somewhere around 1934 to 35. It's not clear exactly what changes, but it seems that Dali was very strategic in the way that he presented himself in terms of sale of his art and cultivating collectors. And I think that probably there was already some tension forming in the mid-1930s between him and Picasso. But of course, when the Spanish Civil War starts and Picasso leaves and decides to never go back as long as Franco has power, which is basically the next 50 years, Dali and him never speak to each other again. And that's really was a big focus of our exhibition, Dali Picasso. Dali's constantly thinking about Picasso. Picasso, as far as he's concerned, Dali doesn't exist. Dali becomes a non-entity by the mid-1930s, late 1930s.
he was always the greatest of everything. So I'm sure that must have had a reaction to him. But also, Dali was very plastic in his own identity.
Yep.
In terms of his art, and I guess also probably in terms of his heritage.
Absolutely. I think with the Picasso-Dali dynamic, it's pretty much that Picasso wove himself into the culture of the left. Particularly the show has a little bit to do with that with Paul Éluard and people in Paris who were leaning towards the left and eventually communism. Dali could not have been more, opposed to that idea as a monarchist. And so I think for all of them, he really became a non-entity. And so in his reactionary decisions against these traditional leftist ideas, when Dali leaves Surrealism, he's basically a non-entity, not only to Picasso, but to many of his former colleagues.
Become a non-entity to Dali.
No. Picasso was always on Dali's mind, always and forever. Every year, Dali would write a postcard to Picasso that was not responded to, but Picasso kept them. So that's kind of interesting. Any other questions before we wrap it up? Okay, yes.
These two medals that were given by the King and Queen of Spain, do we know where they are?
We have them in our archive upstairs. They're left here with our collection, and that's a really good point. It's been probably a long time since we presented those to the public, but that's a really important legacy that we have with the Morses. So thanks for that reminder. Absolutely, we'll talk about that. Okay, so again, thank you all for coming out this morning.